The calm, serene air of the orchard belied the storm brewing within. The sun hung heavy in the sky, casting long shadows over the neat rows of apple trees, each branch laden with fruit ripe for picking. But amidst the beauty, there was a lingering unease, a whispered tension among those who worked the land. The smell of damp earth mixed with the faint tang of fresh apples, but underneath it all, there was something foul, an unspeakable act that had stained the land. The discovery of a body in the orchard was no accident, nor a mere tragic event. It was a chilling reminder of how far people will go to protect their darkest secrets. In the midst of this quiet town, where everyone knew everyone's business, or so they thought, Miss Marple would uncover a web of lies that spanned years, if not decades. What was once an idyllic corner of the world was about to reveal its rotten core. Before we plunge into the depths of this mystery, be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss any twists and turns in this case. Your support means the world, and it helps us bring these thrilling stories to life. Now, let's step into the shadows of the orchard and unearth the secrets buried there. Chapter 1. The Orchard's Secret. The orchard stretched as far as the eye could see, a patchwork of meticulously tended trees heavy with fruit. The air was thick with the scent of ripe apples, their glossy skins gleaming under the unrelenting sun. It was a picturesque scene, as idyllic as any postcard, a tranquil testament to the hard work that had gone into cultivating the land. Yet within this perfect harmony, there was a sense of something far more sinister, something lurking beneath the surface that no one dared acknowledge, until the body was found. It wasn't the first time something had gone wrong at the orchard, not by a long shot. Over the years, there had been whispers of disputes, disagreements over land, over inheritance, over what belonged to whom. But such things were always hushed up, buried under the weight of civility. People had become too accustomed to their own comfort, too accustomed to the image of a prosperous community, to think that anything truly dark could happen here. After all, who would want to disturb the peace of such a quiet, sheltered place? But there, in the heart of the orchard, sprawled face down in the damp grass, was the lifeless body of the owner, Timothy Pritchard. The man, once the epitome of rural success, had met his end in a manner that sent shockwaves rippling through the quiet village. There were no obvious signs of violence, no visible wounds, but something about the scene felt wrong, out of place. Miss Marple had received the call early that morning. The news of the murder spread like wildfire, and the village, once so familiar and calm, felt transformed. People who had lived side by side for years now looked at each other with suspicion, as if the very ground beneath their feet had shifted. The orchard, once a symbol of peace and prosperity, now stood as a grim reminder of what darkness lay beneath the surface of even the most picturesque villages. Miss Marple had arrived not long after the body was discovered. Her sharp eyes, as always, missed nothing. She moved with quiet determination, her mind already whirring through 1,000 possible scenarios. This was not a random act of violence. She could feel it in her bones. There was something far more personal at play, something deeper and more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. Her first step was simple: take in the surroundings. The orchard was still, save for the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. The silence felt unnatural, as if even nature had stopped to witness the tragedy. The body had been found near the farthest corner of the orchard, away from the well-traveled paths, hidden from view by the thick foliage of the trees. It was as if someone had gone to great lengths to make sure it wouldn't be discovered too quickly. And yet, there it was. As Miss Marple stood there, her gaze sweeping over the orchard, the morning air seemed to thicken around her. There was something cold in the way the sun's rays filtered through the branches, casting long, distorted shadows over the ground. It wasn't just the body that felt wrong. It was the entire scene, the unnatural stillness of the orchard, the faint rustling that didn't quite belong, the subtle shift in the atmosphere, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. She stepped closer to the body, noting the way it lay so unnaturally in the grass. Timothy Pritchard's face was a pale mask of shock, his mouth slightly agape, as though the very moment of death had caught him by surprise. His hands were curled into fists, a detail that Miss Marple would not overlook. It was a small thing, yet telling. A person does not die with clenched fists unless they have been caught in the throes of something urgent, something desperate. She crouched beside the body, her sharp eyes scanning the surroundings. No sign of struggle, no sign of any direct confrontation. Just the stillness, the quiet death. But as her gaze moved downward, something caught her attention. His shoes, slightly scuffed, the soles worn in places as if he had been running or walking briskly before his end. It was an odd thing to note, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that it was the smallest details, the things that seemed insignificant at first glance, which often told the biggest stories. Was it a natural death then? A voice behind her asked. Miss Marple turned to face the newcomer, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. Inspector Barnaby, a man she had known for years, stood at the edge of the clearing, his posture stiff with the weight of the task ahead. He was one of the few who still saw the value in Miss Marple's presence, even when others thought her methods a bit unorthodox. "No," she said softly, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who had seen this too many times before. This was no accident, nor was it some unfortunate turn of fate. This is something else. Barnaby eyed her cautiously. He had always respected her intuition, but he wasn't quite ready to abandon the notion of a natural death just yet. He stepped closer, his boots crunching softly on the fallen leaves. "There's no sign of violence," he said, more to himself than to Miss Marple. "No wounds, no struggle, no poison that we can find." Miss Marple looked at him, her gaze unwavering. "The absence of violence doesn't mean it wasn't intentional," she replied, her words tinged with the quiet certainty that only came with experience. Sometimes, death is not so much about what happens, but about what is left undone, what's left hidden. Inspector Barnaby didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked down at the body, his brow furrowing as he tried to make sense of what Miss Marple had said. But Miss Marple had already moved on, her eyes now drawn to the distant edge of the orchard. Her mind was already turning, already piecing together the puzzle that was slowly beginning to form. A few paces away, under a large oak tree, Miss Marple saw something that made her pause. A small bundle of fabric, half hidden beneath a pile of leaves. She moved quickly, kneeling to uncover it. It was a woman's scarf, frayed at the edges, its vibrant red color contrasting sharply with the dull earth beneath it. She picked it up, holding it between her fingers. The fabric was soft, expensive even, but it had been carelessly discarded, as if someone had thrown it away in a moment of panic. Her mind began to work again, the connections forming, however faint. The scarf, the clenched fists, the strange quietness of the orchard. None of this was an accident. Someone had orchestrated this, planned it, and that someone had been careful, leaving just enough behind to make it all the more difficult to piece together. As Miss Marple stood, the fabric still clutched in her hand, she knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that this was only the beginning. Miss Marple rose slowly, her hands still holding the scarf, her thoughts moving like quicksilver. The pieces of the puzzle were scattered, disjointed, yet they were all there, whispers of a deeper story hidden in plain sight. The orchard, once a peaceful sanctuary, now felt like a stage, and she, an unwilling player, thrust into a drama she had yet to fully understand. Inspector Barnaby had stepped back, allowing her the space to inspect the scene. He was used to Miss Marple's methods, the way she moved through a crime scene as if she were reading the air itself. He respected her, but he was also wary. He knew how quickly she could unravel a case, and how impossible it was to keep up with her once she had set her mind to it. "What do you make of it then?" Barnaby asked, his voice cautious. He wasn't the type to be easily spooked, but there was something unnerving about the calmness with which Miss Marple approached death. It was as if she saw beyond the blood and the violence to something more profound, something far more unsettling. Miss Marple's gaze remained fixed on the scarf for a moment longer, as if the red fabric held some clue she couldn't quite decipher. "The question is not whether this is a murder," she said, finally breaking the silence. "The question is, who stands to gain from it?" The inspector frowned. "Gaining from a death? It's hardly a simple matter of inheritance, Miss Marple." "Ah, but it rarely is, Inspector," she replied, her voice a whisper of a smile. "Nothing in life is ever quite as simple as we'd like it to be." She walked back to the body, her eyes scanning the ground around it. The faintest trace of something glinted in the sunlight, just a flash, barely noticeable, but enough to catch her trained eye. She bent down and reached for it, her fingers brushing the earth as she uncovered a small, delicate object, a silver button, half buried in the dirt. She held it up, examining the fine craftsmanship. It was beautiful, polished to a mirror sheen, and yet it had clearly been lost in the rush of whatever had occurred here. The button was unlike any she had seen before, with intricate designs etched into its surface. It was too fine to belong to just anyone. It was something worn by someone of higher status, someone who understood the value of appearances. Barnaby took a step forward. "Do you think this belongs to the victim?" he asked, though there was a hint of disbelief in his voice. A button, a small thing, didn't seem like much to go on, but Miss Marple's mind had already moved past the obvious. She could feel the weight of the answer coming closer, just out of reach, yet it was tantalizingly near. "No," she said softly, almost to herself. "This doesn't belong to Mr. Pritchard. It's too delicate, too polished for someone like him. No, this belongs to someone else, someone with a taste for finer things." She stood and looked around the orchard once more. The trees, the ground, the distant hills, they all held their secrets. The weight of lives lived and lost, all of them hidden in plain sight. She could almost hear the whispers of the past, the voices of those who had walked this land before her. The air felt thicker now, heavy with the stories of the dead. Barnaby remained silent for a moment, taking in the quiet yet growing tension. "So you think someone from outside the orchard did this?" Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. She was still lost in thought, her gaze drifting over the scene. Her mind was piecing it together, slowly but surely. There was no violence, no sign of forced entry, nothing that screamed murder in the usual sense. And yet, the subtle clues, small things like the button in the scarf, the clenched fists, and the stillness of the orchard, told a different story. This wasn't some random act of violence. This was a carefully crafted event, one that had been planned long before the victim ever stepped foot in that corner of the orchard. "No," Miss Marple finally said, her voice calm, steady. "I don't think this was an outsider at all. The killer is much closer than we realize." Chapter 2. Whispers of the Past. As the day wore on, the orchard seemed to shift from a place of eerie stillness to one of hushed whispers. The villagers had gathered in small groups, their murmurs carrying on the wind, each one casting furtive glances toward the area where the body had been found. For all their curiosity, for all their concern, no one dared approach the site of the murder again. It was as though the land itself had become contaminated, marked by the stain of death. Miss Marple, ever observant, had remained at the scene long after the others had retreated. Inspector Barnaby had gone to consult the local constable, leaving her to sift through the remnants of the day's discovery. In the solitude of the orchard, her thoughts began to unfurl, each detail coming together like a piece of a long-forgotten puzzle. But there was still much that didn't make sense. The button, the scarf, the lack of violence. It was as if the crime itself had been carefully orchestrated, like a play with no audience. But why? The afternoon sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting a golden hue over the rows of apple trees. Miss Marple walked slowly, her eyes taking in the orchard once more, looking for something that had been missed before. Her mind drifted back to Timothy Pritchard, the victim. He was a man who had built this orchard with his own hands, a man who was known for his solid reputation and quiet authority. Yet beneath that surface, there were always rumors, whispers of his dealings, of his relationships, and of a past that had never quite settled. The question Miss Marple needed to answer wasn't just who had killed him, it was why. And to understand that, she knew she had to go deeper, much deeper, into the past that had shaped this village. That evening, she sought out those who had known Pritchard the longest. It wasn't hard to find the older generation who had lived in the village for decades, those who had seen the rise and fall of Pritchard's fortunes, those who had watched as his orchard grew into the pride of the town. Their memories were sharp despite their age, and they were eager to talk, eager to reminisce about a time when things had been simpler, when the orchard was the heart of the village. Miss Marple's first stop was Mrs. Darnell, an elderly woman who had lived on the outskirts of the village for nearly 70 years. Mrs. Darnell had known Pritchard since he was a boy, and her memories of him were tinged with both warmth and suspicion. Timothy was always a quiet one, Mrs. Darnell said, her hands trembling slightly as she sipped her tea. Never one for loud company or grand gestures. But there was something off about him in the later years. You could see it in his eyes, you know? Like he was always waiting for something, or maybe someone. As though he'd made a deal with the devil, but couldn't quite remember what the price was. Miss Marple listened intently, her fingers tapping lightly on the edge of her teacup. "A deal with the devil?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Darnell nodded slowly, her gaze distant. "Yes, dear. You see, Timothy inherited that orchard from his father, but it wasn't always smooth sailing. There were debts, lots of them. And then there was the strange company he kept. Foreigners mostly, people who didn't quite belong in our village. There were whispers, of course, rumors about shady dealings, about men who could never be traced." "Do you remember any of them?" Miss Marple asked, leaning forward. Mrs. Darnell shook her head. "No, dear. It was always like that. Whispers in the night, faces half seen in the fog. But the one thing I do remember clearly is that the orchard itself changed. It wasn't just the apples that grew. No, there was something else, something more. It was as if the land itself had absorbed something dark." Miss Marple felt a chill run down her spine. She thanked Mrs. Darnell for her time and promised to return if she needed more information. As she left the woman's home, her mind was racing. The orchard, this seemingly tranquil patch of land, was at the center of it all. But what was it about the land that made it so dangerous? What was it that Pritchard had been hiding, or perhaps protecting? She needed more answers, and she knew where to go next. The town's ledger, the records of transactions, of debts paid and debts still owed, would be her next destination. They were kept in the small local archives, a dusty room filled with old books and papers tucked away in the back of the village hall. It was there, Miss Marple knew, that the true history of Timothy Pritchard and the orchard itself could be found. The local archives were as musty as Miss Marple remembered, the scent of aged paper and leather binding heavy in the air. The room was dim, with narrow windows that let in only slivers of light, casting long shadows over the rows of dusty ledgers and record books. The shelves creaked under the weight of years, each volume a silent witness to the history of the village, its triumphs, its losses, and everything in between. Miss Marple moved with practiced ease, her fingers brushing lightly over the spines of the books as she searched for the ledger containing records of Timothy Pritchard's dealings. It wasn't long before she found what she was looking for, an old, leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age, its cover cracked and worn. She carefully opened it, her eyes scanning the neat, precise entries written in black ink. At first glance, the records seemed unremarkable. Payments for labor, for equipment, for harvests, nothing that stood out. But Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the small discrepancies. A debt to a man named Horace Blackwell, an unfamiliar name to her, listed in the year before Pritchard's death. It wasn't a large sum, but the terms of the agreement were unclear. And then there was the unusual frequency of payments made to a series of foreign merchants. The names were foreign-sounding, hard to pronounce, their origins far from the quiet village of Little Ashford. As she flipped through the pages, she noticed that the entries for the year before Pritchard's death were filled with an increasing sense of urgency. There were more debts, more payments, and yet the record seemed incomplete, as though some entries had been intentionally left out or erased. The final payment, dated just weeks before his death, was marked with a simple note: "Final settlement. Done." But what had been settled? And why had it taken so long to reach that point? Miss Marple closed the ledger with a soft snap, her mind racing. The orchard was tied to something far larger than she had initially imagined. There were debts, hidden ones, tangled in a web of transactions that reached far beyond the borders of this sleepy village. Someone had been watching Pritchard closely, pushing him into this corner, forcing him to make decisions that, in the end, had led to his demise. She stood there for a moment, her fingers drumming lightly on the edge of the ledger. There was something off about the entire situation. Why had Pritchard been so desperate? Why had he surrounded himself with such strange people, dealt with foreigners whose names were never spoken of openly? And what did these transactions have to do with the orchard? The answers, she knew, were buried deep in the tangled threads of the past, and the more she dug, the darker the truth seemed to get. The evening was drawing near when she left the archives, the weight of the ledger still heavy in her hands. She made her way back through the village, her mind working on overdrive, connecting pieces that had once seemed distant, now converging into a singular, uncomfortable truth. The orchard, the debt, the whispers, it all led back to one thing: a man who had become too entangled in his own lies. Her next step was clear. She would need to confront those who had been closest to Pritchard. But there was one person she had yet to speak with. A person who, Miss Marple suspected, might know more than anyone. Alice Walker, the young woman who had worked alongside Pritchard for years. A woman whose devotion to the orchard had always seemed unquestionable. Yet there was something about her silence that didn't sit right with Miss Marple. Miss Marple arrived at the Walker household just as the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky. Alice greeted her at the door with a polite, almost detached smile, but Miss Marple could see the tension in her eyes, the subtle way she shifted her weight from one foot to the other. "Miss Walker, may I have a word?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm, but with an undercurrent of authority. Alice nodded, stepping aside to let her enter. The house was modest, with simple furnishings, the scent of baked bread still lingering in the air. But as Miss Marple looked around, she couldn't help but notice how neat everything was, perhaps too neat, as though the house had been prepared for visitors long before Miss Marple had arrived. Alice led Miss Marple into the sitting room, where they sat across from one another, the silence thick between them. Miss Marple studied Alice carefully, her gaze flickering over the young woman's face, looking for any hint of discomfort, any sign that she might know more than she was letting on. "I understand you worked closely with Mr. Pritchard," Miss Marple began, her tone soft but insistent. "For many years, if I'm not mistaken?" Alice's hands folded in her lap, her fingers tightly curled. "Yes, I worked with Mr. Pritchard," she replied, her voice steady, but Miss Marple could hear the subtle tremor underneath. "I helped with the harvests, the maintenance, everything." "And how would you describe your relationship with him?" Miss Marple asked, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. Alice hesitated, her lips pressing together before she spoke. "He was kind, in his own way," she said, the words measured, as though she were choosing them carefully. "But there was something distant about him in the end. I don't know if it was the work or the pressure, but he became harder to read." Miss Marple leaned in slightly, her gaze sharp. "Did he ever mention anything about debt? About owing anything to anyone?" Alice's eyes flickered, a brief but telling moment of hesitation. It was enough. Miss Marple's instincts told her that Alice knew more than she was letting on. But the young woman remained silent, her lips pressed tight as if holding a secret. Miss Marple watched Alice closely, her mind moving like a quiet storm, sifting through the subtle cues in the room. The hesitation, the tightness in Alice's posture. There was something she was holding back. Miss Marple knew that people rarely lied outright, but they often revealed much more through what they didn't say, through the spaces between their words. Alice cleared her throat, her hands clasping tighter in her lap. "Mr. Pritchard wasn't one to talk about money," she said finally, her voice quieter now, almost as though speaking the words aloud might make them real. "But I did hear him mention a name once, a man from the city. I don't know much about him, just that Mr. Pritchard seemed troubled by him. I think they had dealings, but they were always secretive about it." Miss Marple's interest piqued. "A man from the city," she repeated, pressing gently. "Did you ever hear his name?" Alice's face flushed slightly, her eyes darting toward the window as if she could avoid the question by simply not answering it. But Miss Marple remained silent, waiting for her to speak, letting the silence hang between them like a thick fog. After what seemed like an eternity, Alice spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Horace Blackwell," she said, almost as if she were afraid the name itself might summon something terrible. "I heard him mention it once in passing. I don't know who he was, but Mr. Pritchard was nervous about him. That much I could tell. It was in the way he looked when he spoke of him, like he was afraid of something. But I never asked more. It wasn't my place." Miss Marple's thoughts clicked together with a sudden, sharp clarity. Horace Blackwell. The name had appeared in the records buried among the foreign merchants and the debts that seemed to stretch beyond the village's borders. But why had Pritchard been so afraid of him? And why had Alice, who worked so closely with him, never thought to ask? Miss Marple stood, her eyes still on Alice. "Thank you for telling me this, Miss Walker. I know it must have been difficult, but I believe you know more than you're letting on." Alice's gaze fell to her hands, her face paling slightly. "I don't know anything else, I swear," she said, her voice quivering. "I don't know why he was so afraid of Blackwell, only that he was. But I do know that he was changing. There was something wrong with him, and that's all I know." Miss Marple nodded, her face betraying no emotion, but inside, the pieces were clicking together with an unsettling finality. Alice had given her just enough to keep her moving forward, enough to know that Pritchard's death wasn't a random act, but part of something larger, something darker. There were debts, both financial and personal, and at the heart of it was Horace Blackwell. The question now was, what had Pritchard done to tie himself to such a man, and how had it cost him his life? As she left Alice's home, Miss Marple could feel the weight of the mystery bearing down on her. The orchard, the debts, the mysterious figure of Horace Blackwell. All these threads were beginning to weave themselves into something larger than she had anticipated. The truth was no longer just a matter of solving a murder. It was about understanding the intricate web of choices, of debts paid and unpaid, of fears and desires that had led to this single, violent moment. The air outside was cool now, the last traces of sunlight vanishing behind the hills. Miss Marple walked slowly, the quiet town of Little Ashford stretching before her, its sleepy facade still intact, though she knew it wouldn't remain so for much longer. There was much left to uncover, and she would not rest until every last thread had been pulled. no matter how dark the truth proved to be. Chapter 3. A Web of Lies. The days that followed were a blur of faces, whispered secrets, and veiled truths. The village had gone quiet after the discovery of Pritchard's body, but beneath that surface of calm, tension simmered. Miss Marple moved through the streets with a quiet purpose, her eyes catching every detail. The way people avoided eye contact, the way conversations dropped off whenever she entered a room, the way everyone seemed to know more than they were willing to share. It became clear to her that Little Ashford, for all its peaceful charm, was a town built on secrets. And the more she uncovered, the more she realized that Pritchard's death was not an isolated incident, but rather the culmination of a long-running series of deceptions that stretched back years, weaving through the lives of the people in this village like a poison in the water. The next person Miss Marple decided to speak with was Dr. Hargrave, the town's physician, who had tended to Pritchard in the months leading up to his death. The doctor was an enigmatic man, well liked in the community, but, as Miss Marple had learned, not particularly forthcoming when it came to matters of his patients' private lives. She found him in his office, a small, dimly lit room filled with the smell of antiseptic and the faintest trace of something floral, perhaps a bottle of perfume or a scented candle. Dr. Hargrave was tall and thin, his once youthful face now etched with the lines of experience, though his eyes still held the sharpness of a man accustomed to noticing everything, even when he didn't wish to. "Miss Marple," he greeted her, his voice smooth but tinged with something she couldn't quite place. "I wasn't expecting you. I trust there's no trouble with my practice?" "No," Miss Marple replied, her voice calm, though her mind was already calculating. "I was hoping you could help me with something else. I've come to ask about Timothy Pritchard. You treated him recently, didn't you?" The doctor's expression flickered for just a moment, but it was enough for Miss Marple to notice. He was hiding something, and she could feel the subtle shift in the atmosphere, the way his shoulders tensed as if bracing himself for something. "Yes, I treated Mr. Pritchard," Dr. Hargrave said, his voice guarded. "He had a few minor ailments, nothing serious. He came to me for a checkup, a cough that wouldn't go away. There's nothing noteworthy about his visits." Miss Marple watched him closely. "You're certain there was nothing else?" she asked, her gaze unblinking. "No signs of stress? No unusual symptoms? Nothing that might suggest he was being pressured or perhaps even frightened?" The doctor hesitated for a moment, his fingers tracing the edge of a medical chart on his desk. "He was under stress," he admitted slowly. "But it wasn't anything out of the ordinary for a man in his position. Running an orchard, especially one as large as his, can take a toll on a person. And he did have some financial trouble, though he never spoke about it in detail. He never once came to me for advice on that matter." "And did you ever see him with anyone unusual? Anyone who might have been a source of his stress?" Miss Marple pressed, her tone soft but insistent. The doctor's eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment, Miss Marple could almost see the man's thoughts warring within him. Then, as if making a decision, he leaned forward, his voice dropping a notch. "There was one man," Dr. Hargrave said quietly, his gaze flicking to the door before returning to Miss Marple. "I didn't want to mention it before, but now that you're asking, I think you should know. A few weeks before he died, Pritchard came to me with a request. He needed something that I could not provide, something more specific than any of the usual prescriptions. But I believe he was seeking relief from something far deeper than just illness. Miss Marple's interest sharpened. What kind of request? He asked me for a sedative, the doctor continued, his voice lowering even further. A powerful one. He was having trouble sleeping, and he was worried about his situation, but I didn't give it to him. I couldn't. I'm not one to prescribe such things lightly, especially not to someone in his state. Miss Marple leaned in, her fingers pressing lightly on the edge of the desk. What state was that, Dr. Hargrave? You mentioned his situation. What was he afraid of? The doctor's eyes flickered again, and Miss Marple could see the battle in his mind. He was reluctant to speak, but Miss Marple knew that the truth had a way of coming out eventually, especially when faced with someone who wouldn't let go of the question. I don't know exactly, Dr. Hargrave said finally, his voice heavy with regret. But I suspect it had something to do with those men from the city, the ones who were always circling around him. They weren't just business associates, Miss Marple. There was something darker about them. I think Pritchard was entangled in something he couldn't escape. Miss Marple stood in silence for a moment, absorbing the information. The pieces were falling into place, slowly but steadily. Pritchard had been in debt, and those debts were tied to people much more dangerous than anyone in the village could imagine. And now, with Dr. Hargrave's admission, Miss Marple was more certain than ever that Timothy Pritchard had paid the ultimate price for his entanglement in something far darker than simple financial mismanagement. She thanked Dr. Hargrave and left his office, her mind already racing ahead. The web of lies was growing more intricate by the day, and each thread she pulled at seemed to lead her deeper into the darkness surrounding the orchard, and the man who had lost his life there. Miss Marple's thoughts were a labyrinth, each new revelation drawing her deeper into the heart-to mystery that had grown far more complex than she could have imagined. The more she learned about Timothy Pritchard, the more she began to understand that his death was not the result of a random act of violence, but rather the culmination of a long series of choices, each one leading him further down a path he had never fully understood, until it was too late. As she walked through the village that evening, her eyes drawn to the familiar faces of the townsfolk, she could feel the weight of the secrets they all carried. Each one of them had something to hide, something that connected them to Pritchard, something that, in the end, had led to his demise. They were all tied together in a web of lies, and Miss Marple knew that only by unraveling each thread would she uncover the truth. Her next stop was the local tavern, a dark and smoky place where men gathered to drink away the day's worries. It was the kind of place where secrets were spoken in hushed tones, where deals were made over pints of ale, and where no one truly ever left the past behind. The tavern keeper, a burly man named George, greeted her with a nod as she entered, his face betraying no sign of surprise. Miss Marple had visited the tavern on occasion, though she had never lingered long. It wasn't a place for women, especially not women of her age, but she knew that this was where the heart of the village's secrets beat the loudest. She made her way to a corner where the shadows were thick and the air smelled of stale beer and tobacco. The low murmur of conversation around her seemed to fall away as she approached the table where two men sat. deep in discussion. One of them, a burly farmer named Frank, looked up as she approached, his face flushing slightly. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice gruff. "What brings you to this fine establishment?" "I was hoping you might be able to help me," Miss Marple replied, her tone soft but insistent. She had always been skilled at making people feel at ease, and Frank, though no stranger to hard work, was no exception. "I'm looking into the death of Mr. Pritchard, and I understand that you were close to him. Perhaps you can tell me what you know." Frank shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his large hands fidgeting with the handle of his mug. "I didn't know Pritchard as well as some," he said cautiously, "but I saw him often enough. He wasn't the kind of man to confide in others, not when it came to his troubles. He kept his business to himself." "And yet," Miss Marple said, her eyes narrowing slightly, "you were often seen in his company. You had dealings with him, didn't you?" Frank hesitated, his eyes darting to the man sitting across from him, a tall, wiry figure who had remained silent until now. The man's sharp eyes met Miss Marple's, and for a brief moment, she saw something flash behind them. A quick flicker of recognition, of something more than casual acquaintance. She could feel the tension between them, the unspoken words hanging in the air like a thick fog. "George here," Frank said slowly, nodding to the tavern keeper. "He's the one who knows the most about Pritchard's dealings. I was just a man who helped out from time to time, fixing fences or tending to the harvest. But George, he was there when the money started flowing. He might know more than I do." Miss Marple turned her gaze to George, her expression calm but probing. "Is that true, Mr. Blackwell? Did you have dealings with Mr. Pritchard?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. George's face froze for just a moment, his grip tightening on the mug in front of him. Then, with a forced smile, he leaned back in his chair, his voice smooth, but tinged with something Miss Marple didn't quite trust. "I had no dealings with Pritchard beyond the usual," he said, his eyes never quite meeting hers. "The man was a customer, nothing more. He bought his drinks here, just like any other man in this town. And if you're insinuating something, well, you've got it wrong, Miss Marple." Miss Marple didn't flinch, her gaze unwavering. "It's not so much what I'm insinuating, Mr. Blackwell, as what you're failing to mention. You see, I've heard rumors of a man who came from the city, someone who made sure the debts were paid, someone who had more than a passing interest in Mr. Pritchard's orchard. Do you know anything about this man?" The tavern fell silent, the atmosphere thickening as the two men exchanged glances. Frank shifted in his seat, his unease palpable. George, on the other hand, remained calm, his eyes narrowing as he regarded Miss Marple. "I don't know who you're talking about," he said flatly. "There's no man from the city, no one who's made Mr. Pritchard do anything he didn't want to do." "You've got it all wrong, Miss Marple. If you're looking for trouble, you'll find it here. But it's not in the direction you think." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes glinting with quiet satisfaction. "Perhaps," she said softly, "but the trouble, Mr. Blackwell, has already found you." Chapter 4. The Darkness Beneath. The days grew heavier as Miss Marple delved deeper into the shadows that seemed to cling to the very earth of Little Ashford. Each new revelation, each thread pulled from the tangled web, led her closer to a darkness that had been festering beneath the surface of the village for far longer than anyone had imagined. The orchard, once a symbol of prosperity and peace, was now the epicenter of something far more sinister. And with every step she took, Miss Marple could feel the weight of the past pressing down on her, the ghosts of old debts and hidden sins whispering in the air. Miss Marple had never been one to rely on mere coincidences, and as she continued her investigation, the connections between the people of the village grew clearer. The debts, the lies, the whispered conversations, all of them pointed to something deeper, something darker than simple financial ruin or business deals gone awry. What had started as a murder investigation had now become a journey into the very heart of human nature, a search for the truth buried beneath layers of fear, guilt, and betrayal. One evening, Miss Marple found herself standing at the edge of the orchard once more, the last vestiges of sunlight casting long shadows over the rows of apple trees. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves, and the scent of ripe fruit lingered in the air. But even here, in this place that should have felt peaceful, Miss Marple could sense the suffocating weight of the secrets that lingered in the soil, as if the land itself had absorbed the lies and deceptions of years gone by. Her thoughts turned to the people she had spoken to, the tavern keeper, the doctor, Alice Walker, and to the growing realization that all of them were connected, whether they knew it or not. Each one had been a part of the puzzle. Each one had played a role in the unfolding tragedy, even if they hadn't realized it at the time. As Miss Marple stood there, lost in thought, a figure approached from the far end of the orchard. It was Alice Walker, her steps hesitant as she drew closer, her face pale in the dimming light. "Miss Marple," Alice said, her voice quiet but urgent. "I need to speak with you. It's about Timothy. It's about the orchard." Miss Marple turned to face her gaze steady. "What is it, Miss Walker?" she asked, her voice soft yet full of quiet authority. Alice glanced around nervously, as though checking to make sure no one else was listening. She took a deep breath, then spoke, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I didn't tell you everything back at my house," she said, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and guilt. "I didn't tell you about the last time I saw him, the night he died." Miss Marple said nothing, but her heart quickened. She stepped closer to Alice, urging her to continue. "I didn't want to believe it," Alice whispered, her voice trembling. "But now, I know I have to tell someone. The night before he died, Timothy came to see me. He was different, like someone had broken him. He looked so pale, so afraid. And he told me he was going to fix everything, that he was going to make things right, that he would finally be free of the men who had been controlling him." Miss Marple's mind raced, but she kept her voice calm. "What men, Miss Walker? Who was he talking about?" Alice shook her head, her eyes welling with tears. "I don't know their names, but I know they were the ones he had been working with for years. They weren't just businessmen, Miss Marple. They were dangerous. Timothy had been involved in something far worse than any of us realized. He was trying to get out, to sever his ties with them before it was too late. But it was already too late." Alice took a shaky breath, her eyes filled with both sorrow and terror. "Timothy told me that night that he was going to meet with them one last time, to end things once and for all. He begged me to help him, but I couldn't. I didn't know how. The next morning, he was dead. Miss Marple stood in silence for a long moment, taking in Alice's words. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but they were forming a picture far darker than she had anticipated. Pritchard's death had not been a simple murder, nor had it been an act of random violence. It was a consequence of something far more insidious, something far-reaching. "Do you think those men were the ones who killed him?" Miss Marple asked, her voice low, heavy with the weight of the question. Alice nodded slowly, her eyes downcast. "Yes, I don't know how they did it, but I know they were involved. Timothy was trying to get away from them, and they couldn't let him go, not when there was so much at stake." Miss Marple's mind was racing now, her thoughts spinning like a whirlpool. This was no ordinary murder. This was the result of a complex web of lies, of power and control, of men who would stop at nothing to keep their secrets hidden. And the more she uncovered, the more she realized that the true story of Timothy Pritchard's death was far from over. She looked at Alice, her gaze steady and filled with quiet understanding. "Thank you for telling me this," she said softly. "You've given me a crucial piece of the puzzle. But now we must find the answers. Answers that will reveal the truth of what happened here." Alice nodded, her face a mixture of relief and dread. "I just want it to end," she whispered. "And it will," Miss Marple replied quietly, "but not until the darkness beneath the orchard has been brought to light." Chapter 5. The Final Revelation. The days that followed were heavy with anticipation, the village of Little Ashford holding its breath as Miss Marple continued her investigation into the death of Timothy Pritchard. The pieces of the puzzle had finally begun to fall into place, but the truth, as always, was far more complex and far darker than anyone had imagined. Miss Marple had spoken to everyone she could. Each thread, no matter how small, had been carefully unwound and examined. But even with all the information, one question remained. Who was behind Pritchard's murder? Was it the shadowy men from the city? The ones who had ensnared him in their web of deceit and power? Or was there something closer, something more personal, hidden beneath the surface? As Miss Marple stood once more at the edge of the orchard, her gaze sweeping over the rows of apple trees that had once symbolized the prosperity of the village, she felt the weight of the years pressing down on her. The truth had been buried in this land for far too long, but now it was time to uncover it all, to reveal the darkness that had festered in the shadows, waiting to be exposed. The final piece of the puzzle came on a cold, overcast morning when Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. It was George, the tavern keeper, the man who had so carefully shielded his secrets and avoided the truth. He appeared at her doorstep, his face tight, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and fear. He had come at last to confess, to give her the final clue that would bring the entire mystery into focus. "I know you've been asking about me," George said, his voice rough. "About my involvement with Pritchard, about Blackwell. And I've been running from the truth for too long, Miss Marple, but I can't run anymore." Miss Marple listened quietly, her expression unreadable as George continued. "Pritchard didn't die by the hands of those men from the city," George said, his voice trembling with the weight of the confession. "No, it was me. I was the one who killed him." The words struck Miss Marple like a thunderclap, but she remained composed, her face as calm as ever. She had suspected there was more to George than met the eye, but hearing him admit it outright was another matter entirely. "Why?" she asked, her voice steady, the single word carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken questions. George's eyes filled with regret, his shoulders slumping as though the confession itself had drained the last of his strength. "It was the debt," he said, his voice cracking. "The money that Pritchard owed to Blackwell. It wasn't just money, it was power, and I got caught in it. I became his partner in a way. I thought I could escape, that I could control it. But in the end, I was just another pawn in his game." He paused, his eyes flickering to the floor as though unable to meet Miss Marple's gaze. "Pritchard came to me that night. He was begging, desperate to get out of it, to cut ties with Blackwell. But he was already too deep, Miss Marple. We both were. And when he said he was going to go to Blackwell to end it all, I knew he was making a mistake. I knew he couldn't do it on his own. So I killed him. I didn't want to, but I had to. It was the only way to keep myself from being dragged down with him." Miss Marple remained silent, letting the confession settle between them. Her mind, ever sharp, was already piecing the details together. She had known instinctively that George's involvement had run deeper than he had admitted. The tavern, the strange conversations, the way he had so carefully avoided the truth. It all made sense now. George had been just as trapped by Blackwell as Pritchard, and in his fear, he had taken the only way out he saw. "Did Blackwell know?" Miss Marple asked softly, her voice a whisper in the cold morning air. George shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "No, he didn't know about the murder, but he knew Pritchard was trying to escape. He knew something was wrong, and in the end, it didn't matter. Blackwell got what he wanted, Pritchard's silence, his compliance, but I paid the price. I always knew I would." Miss Marple nodded slowly, taking in everything George had said. The murder had been driven by fear, by desperation, by the weight of debts that could not be repaid, by a man trapped in a system he could not escape. And yet, in the end, it had been an act of betrayal, not just from George, but from all those involved in the web of deceit that had led to this moment. She stood in silence for a long time, the weight of the revelation sinking in. The case was closed, the truth laid bare, but it was a truth that left no satisfaction in its wake. There was no justice here, no triumph, only the quiet, lingering echoes of lives ruined by the choices of those who had come before. Finally, Miss Marple spoke, her voice soft, almost resigned. "You've done what you can, Mr. Blackwell, but know this, there is no escaping the truth. It will always find its way to the surface, even if it takes years, even if it costs everything." George met her gaze, his face a mask of guilt and despair. "And what happens now?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Now," Miss Marple replied, "you face what's left. The past cannot be undone, but the future is still yours to shape." As she turned to leave, the weight of the case finally lifting from her shoulders, she couldn't help but reflect on the village, on the orchard, and on the people who had lived their lives hidden behind the veil of lies. In the end, it was never the orchard that had been poisoned. It was the people who tended it.